Thank you everyone for coming. This is our first Botanical Garden Speaker of the Year. Has anyone been to one of the lectures last year from the Botanical Garden? A couple of people? Of course, Dr. Benedict. Good. Excellent. So we're really lucky to have speakers come up from the city to talk about their research, and Dr. Vandebroek is going to talk about the work she's been doing in ethnobotany. She's been able to work throughout the Caribbean. She's told me as a dinner about her work in Jamaica. And for those of you who don't understand or know what an ethnobotanist is yet, you'll have a fun time learning about this. It's really a fun collaboration of science and social science as well. So please help me welcome Dr. Vandebroek.
Thank you all at Taft for the invitation to come present my work. I'm an ethnomedical research specialist at the New York Botanical Garden. And whenever I go on a trip and I come back to the US and the immigration officer asks me, so what do you do? I say ethnomedical, and so on. He says, ethno what? So my research is on ethnomedicine, and it has that term has two parts: ethno, which is people, and medicine, which refers to health. And I work with Caribbean immigrant populations in New York City. So ethnomedicine falls in between medical anthropology and ethnobotany. Ethnobotany, there you have again the word ethno, people, and botany, plants. So it's about how people use plants, not only the use of plants, but also the perception and the management of plants. So ethnomedicine is between ethnobotany and medical anthropology, meaning it's not only about how people perceive plants, how they see them, how they use them, and how they manage them for healthcare, but also their beliefs, their cultural beliefs about what causes certain illnesses, how they are preferentially treated, and the healthcare seeking process. So it's the relationship between people, cultures, health, disease, and treatment. So, and I work with immigrant populations from the Caribbean in New York City. I started working at the New York Botanical Garden in 2005 as a postdoc. And before, I had done research in Bolivia, in the highlands and in the Amazon rainforest. And you can think these are very lush, biodiverse areas, whereas New York City is a big metropolis. So when I was invited to come and work in New York City with immigrant communities, I was thinking, this is going to be quickly finished because there are no plants growing in New York City. But, and I will show you that during my lecture, New York City has hundreds of botanicas. These are shops that are operated by immigrants from the Caribbean and Latin America, and that sell products for healing and well-being, including plants. And when I'm talking about medicinal plants, I'm not necessarily talking about homeopathy or processed products. I'm talking about real, dry and fresh crude plant material that people bring from their countries of origins and that they bring to New York City, and I'm going to talk about that today. And you can see here, it's an article from the New York Times that appeared in 2008, and it's a Mexican curandera or healer, and she is holding in her hands these fresh plants in her living room. And she's treating immigrant patients. And that can be for different reasons. It may be that they are not undocumented in the US, so because of their immigrant status. It may be because people perceive that the cost of healthcare, of conventional or of biomedical healthcare is too high. But most of the time, it's also because there are barriers of language and of culture. So people who come here, who grew up in their home countries with using herbal remedies, when they come here, they don't give that up. They continue because it's a cultural practice, it's a cultural belief, and it's important to them. And that's what we're seeing in New York City. And I started studying that in New York City from 2005. And when I came here and I thought this is going to be something that a research project that will be finished in 3 months, well, now we're in 2014, 9 years later, and we're realizing that we're only scraping just the tip of the iceberg, because there are so many different cultural groups living there who all continue to use medicinal plants for healthcare. So I've been working since 2005 predominantly with the Dominican community, immigrants from the Dominican Republic in New York City. And I not only do ethnomedical research in New York City with this community, I also go back to their country of origin, the Dominican Republic, and I make a transnational comparison. And the question there being asked is, what happens with people's use of medicinal plants when they migrate from the Dominican Republic to New York City? Do they continue using the same plants? Do they stop using them? Because in New York City there is a higher availability of healthcare facilities. What is going on? So what you see here on this slide is a Botanica store. And it's a store operated by Latino and Caribbean people, and they sell products for spiritual well-being, can be statues, amulets, but they also sell plants for physical healing. And what you see there outside the shop are these boxes of dried plants, and inside are even more boxes. And here you can see he's selling aloe vera, which they call savia. So these represents doors to different worlds that you can access just with a metro card. You don't need an expensive airplane ticket. Just in your backyard in New York City, you have these tropical wonders, and these plants often come from all over the world. So this was a research project that was funded by the National Institute of Health. They gave us a grant because they recognized that immigrant communities in the US, instead of going to biomedical healthcare providers, prefer to continue with their own traditions of healing and use medicinal plants. So what we did was to make that transnational comparison. Here is in the Caribbean, the island of Hispaniola, which is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And these are Dominicans who migrate to New York City, and we're looking into their use and knowledge of medicinal plants. And here are some pictures that I took in the Dominican Republic, and I'm going to tell you more about that. Healers, a botanica shop in the Dominican Republic, here a healer preparing herbal remedies, and of course the beautiful and lush landscape. And here you have some pictures in New York City. This is a Botanica store in Washington Heights. This is inside a Botanica store in the Bronx. And this is another Botanica store in the Bronx. You might now think, why the Dominican community of all the communities in New York City? Well, my boss, Michael Balick, started doing research with different Latino communities and also with Chinese healers at the end of the 80s. But what happened was, if you would talk to a Chinese healer and say, can you tell me about the herbal remedies that you're using? Most often the healer would take a book from the shelf and say, okay, here is the recipe that I'm using. Whereas if you go to Latino communities, that knowledge had not been written down yet. On the other hand, if you work with different Latino communities, they all have different local names for these plants. And then it becomes very difficult to really understand what botanical species these plants represent. Because even within one community, the Dominican community, people can have different names for one botanical species. So we quickly understood that we had to narrow our research down. And that's why we started working with the Dominican community. It's a community that represents the largest Latino immigrant group in New York City. So it's the largest influx now. Their indicators of health are still less than optimal. Many of them are uninsured. And they have a low utilization of biomedical healthcare services. And last but not least, if you take a taxi in Washington Heights or in the Bronx, and you talk to the cab driver, often he's Dominican, and you ask him, do you know or use medicinal plants? He will say, well, me not necessarily, but my aunt or my mother or my grandmother or my neighbor, and start telling you stories. Even, I just came back 2 days ago from a PhD defense that I was assisting in the Netherlands, and the immigration officer this time in New York City was Dominican. And there was this long line of people waiting, and he said, so what are you? I said, ethnomedical. He said, ethno what? I said, you know what? I study medicinal plant use by Latino immigrants in New York City. And he starts telling me a story about a plant that I'm going to show you, Cun Amor. Starts going off on a conversation, and there's this long line of people waiting who wants to leave the airport, who starts to look angry at me. But no, I mean, people are engaged in their herbal remedies. So our project consisted of two parts, two phases. The first phase was that we would record through interviews the medicinal plants that people know and use in New York City and in the Dominican Republic to make that comparative analysis. Not only do interviews, but also collect plants. At the same time, also record data of cultural beliefs that people have about health conditions. What do people believe causes their health conditions? And then there was a second phase that consisted of evaluating the efficacy of crude plant extracts to help inflammation. So for that, we had a partner in Mississippi who would take on that part. So we chose a list of conditions and symptoms that we asked people what kind of plants they use to treat those. And we selected a wide diversity of conditions based on two criteria. Their prevalence in the Dominican community in New York City and or the Dominican Republic. And the second criterion was the involvement of inflammation in the pathophysiology of the disease. Because our in vitro, our laboratory model that we were going to test this plant in was an inflammation model. So then we started first with doing field work in New York City, and we selected 174 Dominicans. The map that you see here is areas where most Dominicans live. That's Washington Heights, Upper Manhattan, and the Bronx. There's Corona in Queens, and more dispersed settlements in Brooklyn. So our New York Botanical Garden is in the Bronx, so we're pretty close to the community. And the largest group of people who we interviewed were people who self-medicate with herbal remedies. Meaning they're not healers, they're not plant specialists, they do not identify themselves as such. But they treat themselves, their family, or their friends with herbal remedies. These are called lay people. And then we also interviewed a few plant specialists or healers. We tried to interview as many men and women as possible, but of course it's always harder to find the men during the day because they're off working, and women are more easily available in their households. So we interviewed more women. So after all the interviews, we got a long list of plant names in Spanish. And then you have to cross-link those plant names in Spanish with botanical species. And for that, we went to the Botanica stores. So remember, I already showed you this picture with the plant boxes outside. Now, Botanicas are very interesting stores. And if you get a chance in New York City to go inside one, very eclectic stores. So you have statues for spiritual and religious well-being, you have amulets, you have necklaces, and then you have plants. And what we did, because they're not very well known and there's a high turnover rate, so Botanicas open and close, we don't know how many there are in New York City. So even in the Bronx, we did a systematic survey of 2 zip codes that only represent 4.5% of the total Bronx area. And we found 18 botanicas there, and these are the the green flags that you see here. The blue flag is the New York Botanical Garden. So 18 in such a small area. Then with a student from Columbia University, last year, I went looking for more botanicas in the Bronx, and we found 60 in total. And what we did was do interviews with botanica owners to try to characterize who are they, what kind of plants do they sell, and for what kind of health conditions. So here you can see some pictures. Here you see some more pictures. So here you see like the statues that they are selling for spiritual well-being. Very, very interesting stores. Inside the boxes full of dried plant remedies. So these are often remedies that are cut up. So it's hard to identify them botanically. So what we would do is purchase plant samples and make labels, try to identify them, which can be pretty tricky if all you have is like a stick. So that's why it's important to go back to the country of origin and make botanical collections. So what you see here is a plant sample that I purchased at a botanica. It's the Cun de Amor that the immigration officer was telling me about. It's used predominantly in the Dominican Republic to treat skin rash. So you rub it on your skin. But it's a bitter plant, and a bitter tasting plant is considered good by people to treat any disease that is sweet. Do you know a disease that is sweet that has to do with sweetness?
Diabetes.
Diabetes. So it's used in New York City a lot to treat diabetes. So this is a plant sample that I purchased from a botanica, and these are photographs of the collection that I made in the Dominican Republic. So this species is also eaten, not this one, because this is a wild one and it has very small fruits, but in Asia it's called bitter melon, and you find the fruits in Asian markets. So we interviewed 174 people in New York City. We also did comparative field work in the Dominican Republic, where we interviewed 140 people. And this is a map from the Dominican Republic, and these are the provinces and the number of people we interviewed. And I tried to balance it because I asked New York City participants where they came from in the Dominican Republic, and I tried to link those provinces with my interviews in the DR. So So interviewing people does not only mean you have a questionnaire and you ask them certain questions, it also means that you participate in the preparations of their herbal remedies. And they can be very complicated, like this one. So this one I assisted in the preparation, and we started in the afternoon at 2 o'clock, around 2 o'clock. And we went on all through the afternoon until the evening. And we worked with the candles because there was no electricity in the house. So here, she's actually a healer, someone who prepares botellas or bottled herbal remedies. These are specialists. And here she's preparing a complex mixture of 29 different plant species. And this botella is claimed to be good to treat 51 different health conditions. Whether or not that is the case, that's another question. But it's important to understand the cultural richness of this. So here I'm collecting voucher specimens or botanical specimens. These are plants that are pressed and dried according to botanical standards, meaning that we will try to have a fruit or a flower present, because these are the elements with which we can identify the botanical name of a plant. And I go out with people, again, who are knowledgeable about plants. And they are not just my informants, they're my collaborators. Here I'm using a portable plant press to already start pressing them in the field. During the drying process, these plants are transferred to a local herbarium where they're dried. And the goal is that we have specimens that can be stored in the herbarium so that they can be kept indefinitely if they're treatment well. We still have plant specimens that Darwin collected. So if a plant dies out, we know that we have a record. Here I'm in the community drying and pressing plants. And you might say, why is this so important? And here I go again, first to the botanical names, the local names. So this is a species of Ruellia tuberosa that is native to the West Indies and native to Hispaniola, the island of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. And it's the roots that are used, and you can see these are little tubers. So this is a collection that I made in the Dominican Republic, and this is a plant sample that I purchased from a botanica in New York City. So I can put them both together. And this species in the Dominican Republic is called guauci. But you go to another province and they call it periquito. If you go to Puerto Rico, they call it many roots, or they call it hierba de la calentura. Now, hierba de la calentura is a totally unrelated plant species in the Dominican Republic. So if you go to Jamaica, this plant species is called duppy gun or spirit leaf. So if we would work with different Caribbean groups at the same time, we would get all these names. And remember that I told you, with the Dominican community, I already had a list of 300 names. So imagine that you add more complexity to this. You get a puzzle that you cannot understand. So that's why we're working with one immigrant community at a time, and we're trying to slowly expand our research. And this is important that we get to know which botanical species this represents, because with that species name, we can do a search of the biomedical literature and see if that plant species has been studied in the laboratory, yes or no. Now let me ask you a question. One of the species that Dominicans use is called tuna. Now if you do a biomedical literature search using the word tuna, what do you think you're going to get?
A fish.
Yeah, you get information on the biomedical activity of tuna. For example, heavy metal accumulation in tuna fish. Is that what you want to know? No. So you need to know that tuna is Opuntia ficus indica, the prickly pear cactus, and then you can do a biomedical literature search with that. So this is what I did, a quick search of Ruellia tuberosa, the guauci or the periquito, which is used by Dominicans for infertility, sexually transmitted infections, labor pain, and kidney problems in New York City. This also shows it's not only, because people often think traditional medicine, it's that's used for witchcraft, and I don't know all these things. But it's actually a very modern medicine that's used for real and important problems. And then if we look at the literature, PubMed, which is an important literature search, what do we know about the species? Not that much. We know apparently it's not that toxic. We know that in rats it has protective effects of the stomach. We know that it is good for pain and good for inflammation. And in cells in the laboratory, we know that's an antioxidant, antimicrobial, and cytotoxic. So how can we link that to the traditional uses? That's the next question. What this shows us is that the majority of plants that people actively use have not been very well studied. And this is of relevance for public health. So I record plant names, I make botanical collection, and I identify the plant species botanically. But it's also important that that information is accessible to the general public and to other researchers worldwide. And at the New York Botanical Garden, we do not only have a herbarium of dried botanical species that contains 7.3 million specimens, which is huge, and including specimens that were collected by Darwin. But we also have a virtual herbarium of more than 1 million images of these specimens that we collected and that we stored. And I have a little database that's called Comparative Ethnobotany of the Dominican Republic and New York City, and everybody with an internet connection worldwide can go onto this search page. If you scroll down, you can search for the common name. You can put guauci, and what you get is a collection, a voucher collection, a botanical collection that I made in the Dominican Republic, but also what I call a reference collection of samples that I purchased at a Botanica store or other sites in New York City, and you can compare these. So a healthcare provider, a doctor, a physician in New York City can also go online and look at these images, and you can really zoom in and get all the details. So if the doctor asks his patient or her patient to bring a sample of the herbal remedy that the patient is using, then those images can be consulted. So let's go to the results now. So I compiled a list of plants that people use. I identified their names botanically, but I also asked people what they use them for. And then I ranked the health conditions based on the percentage of herbal remedies that people cited. So what you see from this, and you compare it between New York City and the Dominican Republic, that most of the herbal remedies that people report are used to treat the flu. That doesn't come as a surprise to me. You can see that worldwide. People use a lot of herbal remedies for flu, for common cold, for diarrhea, and so on. But look at what ranks second: diabetes, both in New York City and the Dominican Republic. So that shows us again, traditional medicine is used for modern, chronic lifestyle diseases as well. And that shows it's important. And you can see differences. If you compare New York City with the Dominican Republic, hypertension pops up, high blood pressure, cholesterol pops up. And in the top 10 in the Dominican Republic, you have skin problems, which are prevalent in warm tropical conditions, humid tropical conditions. Another important aspect of our research is that during the interviews, I noticed that people referred a lot to foods that they used as medicine. And these foods were used in a versatile ways. So it could be that the bitter orange juice is drunk, but it can also be that the leaves of the bitter orange are used to prepare tea, to treat something. This is what I call food medicines. And two important examples of food medicines are beetroot or beets, and this is the acerola cherry, the Caribbean cherry. And I contrasted those with what I call non-food medicines, plants that are purely used as medicines, have no food or culinary application. This is, for example, Alpinia zerumbat in the ginger family, and Argemona mexicana in the poppy family. So these are food medicines versus the non-food medicines. It's important to keep in mind. So of course, I do not have time to talk to you about the 300 plus plant species that I recorded in New York City. So I limit myself to the top 5 of the most commonly reported foods. These are lime and lemon, bitter orange, cinnamon, in New York City garlic, in Dominican Republic coconut, and onion. The top 5 of the most commonly reported non-food medicine, number 1 is aloe vera, called savila in Dominican Spanish. Then you have in New York City the castor bean, guinea hen wheat, lemongrass, and chamomile. In the Dominican Republic, you have, after the aloe vera, the guinea hen wheat, the many roots that I talked to you about, the chamomile, and the lemongrass. So one of our primary research questions was when people migrate from the Dominican Republic to New York City, and these are first-generation immigrants, so people who were born in the Dominican Republic but now live in New York City. Is there a difference in their knowledge of the medicinal plants that they report? When you look at that, and I'm just talking about the lay people here, I'm not talking about the plant specialists who report on average the double number of plants, but just to show you, it's quite impressive that a person who is not a plant specialist, but who uses plants for self-medication or to treat his or her family, can report on average 23 medicinal plant species. Think about, can I report 23 plants that I know are used as medicines? I cannot. So this community can, and there is no difference, no statistical difference between New York City and the Dominican Republic. However, if we look at the plants that people report and we split them up in either foods that are used as medicines or the pure medicines, what I call the non-food medicines, now we see that there is a difference. So people who come to New York City start using more food plants as medicines. They do lose knowledge about the non-food medicines, the pure medicines, but they start using more foods as medicines. And it's an important result that we published in PLOS1. It's a journal for the biological sciences. It's important because there is this consensus from the agreement from the general public that people are losing traditions, we're losing plants on our earth, we're losing knowledge, it's all going to hell. But here our study is showing that people's traditional knowledge of plants is quite dynamic. And they may lose knowledge about a certain subset of plants, but they may gain knowledge about another subset of plants. In this case, the food medicines. So let's just look at aloe vera, the number one, the cure-it-all. It's used from everything from good luck to balding to constipation to anything you can imagine. The most commonly cited uses by Dominicans in New York City are respiratory problems, but also diabetes and then skin problems. So what do we know about aloe vera? What does the National Institutes of Health, the authority in the United States, tell us about its use? How is it rated? It's rated possibly effective for psoriasis, skin condition that's linked to inflammation and constipation. Then there is another standard. It's a natural standard, a collaboration of pharmacologists, chemists, biologists, and doctors who look at the evidence that has been compiled about plant remedies, and they rate it as positive scientific evidence for the two conditions that I named, but also for genital herpes, scalp dermatitis. And they say there's insufficient evidence for these conditions, meaning that there is still a debate if they're effective for it or not. But you see, Dominicans use this plant species for conditions that haven't been tested yet. Again, we are lacking information from science. Then also, and I'm telling you something here about our research that we're slowly expanding towards other Latino and Caribbean communities, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans. If we're talking about Latinos, we tend to group them all together as one group, and we pretend to think that they do the same things and use herbal remedies in the same ways. But if you look at, this was a survey among 20 Mexicans, 20 Dominicans, 20 Puerto Ricans, and the Dominicans used aloe vera preferentially to treat the flu, whereas the Puerto Ricans for asthma, chest congestion, and the Mexicans for burns. So again, this shows that we should not have our prejudice and talk about Latinos as one community. So then I told you that we subjected part of our plants to testing in the laboratory, and this was done by the University of Mississippi, one of our partners. We submitted 75 of the most commonly reported plant species, and we subjected them to in vitro models to test their activity against inflammation. The goal here was not to isolate bioactive compounds or to develop new medicines. The goal was to see if there was an evidence base to the traditional use of these herbal remedies. If people cite a lot of herbal remedies for health conditions that have inflammation as a component of the pathophysiology of these conditions, if we take that to the laboratory, are we going to see a lot of efficacy? And we had a 40% hit rate, meaning that 30 species of the 75 that we submitted showed activity in anti-inflammatory models, which is quite high. If you look at random sampling of plants, no traditional uses, then you have about a 10% hit rate. So this provides evidence to the traditional use of plants by people. I'm not saying that any plant that people use medicinally has bioactive components that can be proven in the laboratory. But as a whole, traditional medicine has some truth to it. Another question that we asked during our survey was, where do you get those plants from? Both in New York City and in the Dominican Republic. And Dominicans living in New York City got them mostly from botanicas, those stores. And you have literally hundreds throughout the city. In the Dominican Republic, most people got their plants from their backyard or from their farmlands. Both Dominicans living in New York City and the DR got many plants from bodegas. These are small shops, again, operated by Latinos and Caribbeans. So people have their own sources to procure those plants. We ask people, why do you use herbal remedies? And a common belief is that they use them because they're cheaper. But this is not the most frequently reported answer. People say they're natural, they have less side effects. There is the belief that pharmaceuticals, that they ease the pain, but they do not cure the disease. And here we go into the realm of cultural beliefs. People want to take a herbal remedy and they want to cleanse their body. So they want to see something expelled from their body. And they say when they take pharmaceuticals, you know, they calm the pain, but they harm another organ. We see nothing coming out. We're not vomiting. We don't have diarrhea. When we use medicinal plants and it does something with our body, then we're cleansing ourselves. It's more effective. That may be one of the reasons why people do not want to take pharmaceuticals and prefer their plants. This was a very important and interesting question, and it has led to applying our research. Do you believe there exist health conditions that a medical doctor does not understand or cannot cure? 80% of the people said yes. And this is not Dominicans living in the Dominican Republic. This is Dominicans living in New York City. Of course. And then I said, can you tell me which conditions? And I got this long list. And some are in Spanish, because they are what we call folk illnesses, illnesses that have a strong cultural component. The first one is culebrilla. If you know Spanish, culebra means snake. So the symptoms are that you have a rash on your body and pain, fever, and the rash runs around like a belt, and if the belt closes, the person dies. That's the belief. Based on the symptoms that I'm seeing, you have an idea what that could be? Rash on the back, it runs around, fever, pain, shingles, you got it. So that's culebrilla, shingles. 28 people said no, a medical doctor does not understand that, cannot cure that. I don't want to talk with my doctor about it. I don't believe he can help me. So I go and take my herbal remedies, or I go and see a traditional healer. I do something else. Asthma and pecho apretado, which is chest congestion. Number 3, witchcraft. Number 4, another folk illness, which is called disipela, which I postulate can be 2 things, either lymphatic filariasis, which is a parasitic disease, or a streptococcal infection of the skin. Again, people say this is something we have to cure internally. Don't want to see my doctor for that. And the list goes on: cancer, HIV, diabetes, the evil eye. Empacho, which is a gastrointestinal blockade. Going back to the evil eye is not only something that is present in the Dominican community or in Latino communities, also in Europe there is some belief in the evil eye. And it's one of the reasons, because we have this long list of conditions here, that we have developed a training program for healthcare providers in New York City. And the goal here is to come to culturally effective healthcare, culturally sensitive healthcare, culturally competent healthcare. And we do that because doctors themselves are realizing that they see their Latino patients, they're giving them prescription. The patient takes the prescription, walks out the doctor's door, throws the prescription in the garbage can, and go straight to a botanica. And I talk to people in botanicas all the time. One time, there was a woman diagnosed with ovarian cysts. I said, how do you know? She said, well, I just come from the hospital. I said, so what are you going to do to treat them? She's like, I'm not going back to the hospital. I'm coming here in this botanica and I'm buying a botella, this herbal mixture, because I have faith in this botanica owner. I have faith in his herbal remedies. This is what I want to do. This is what I choose to do. And doctors are realizing that. So they're with us in this training program. Next week on Wednesday, I am having a group of emergency medicine doctors from Metropolitan Hospital Center. I'm taking them, I'm giving them first a lecture, and then I'm taking them to the conservatory, a hot conservatory of the York Botanical Garden. It's a conservatory full of tropical plants, and I'm taking them to the plants, explaining them the uses that Dominicans and Latino communities have for these plants. And I'm also telling them what is known from the biomedical literature about potential toxicity issues related to these plants. So we've developed a training program so that there is increased cross-cultural communication between doctor and patient. Openness, disclosure, that patients are willing to talk to their doctors about this. And here you see me in a botanica, and these are residents, medical residents. This is a botanica owner. Often botanica owners are very knowledgeable, charismatic persons. This person, Don Eliseo, he's not only selling plants. If people have a problem, and that's why we come to the evil eye and we come to witchcraft. But you have to know immigrants who come here, it's not their home country. If you're undocumented, you have a lot of stress. You have a lot of problems adapting, perhaps. And then there's this botanica who not only treats your physical conditions, but also your spiritual and mental health issues. Don Eliseo always tells me stories. He cares for his community. It's immigrants caring for each other. And they have the same cultural beliefs about what causes health conditions. He cares, for example, for persons who have substance abuse problems, like a Puerto Rican man who's in and out of rehab. His family has given up on him. He's not getting better, but the botanica owner prepares a tea for him. He can come by anytime he wants. He doesn't only get the tea, he also gets a meal. So it's an invisible healthcare system. So I'm taking medical students, residents, practicing physicians to Botanica. I take them on a tour of the living plant collection in the New York Botanical Garden, and I talk about these plants, I talk about these health conditions. I also teach classes in Spanish and English, bilingual, of ethnomedical Spanish. It's about how do people describe their health problems. And then I'm working on this guidebook in Spanish for the Dominican community. It's a guidebook to the medicinal uses of plants by the Dominican community in New York City. And then I have plant monographs with pictures. Here, the aloe vera, the savila, so I have a small botanical description, where it's found, what's the part that is used, what are cultural beliefs, how is it used medicinally, and then also a paragraph on precaution, adverse reaction, interaction, and toxicity from the biomedical literature. And I'm developing this publication as a guidebook that the community can use to have a dialogue with their healthcare providers. This is a cartoon that I found, and this also illustrates that the medical administration is increasingly interested in this. You see a patient laying ready for operation, for surgery. In the ER, you have a shaman who's doing a dance here, and you have two surgeons, and one says to the other, yes, I know, but the administration didn't want to appear culturally insensitive. It's a cartoon, of course, but it illustrates that the climate is changing. One of the other applied aspects of our work is that issues of conservation. The herbal remedies that people find, buy in botanicas, that are sold in botanicas by New York City, are not always without conservation issues. So here you see canelilla used in New York City for respiratory problems, headache, and menstrual pain. It's on the IUCN Red List of threatened and endangered species, and its status is vulnerable. Yet, it's available in New York City. Almost any botanica carries it. The USDA, the Agricultural Inspection, often confiscates herbal remedies that people carry in their luggage and asks me to identify. So there's also a conservation aspect of our work. And you know, if you look at the IUCN Red List, less than 1% of the Dominican flora has been assessed. And this is the last couple of slides that I want to show you before you can ask me questions. This was a little project that was done because the Minister of Natural Resources and the Environment in Dominican Republic asked us to do it. It's an ethnobotanical trail that we developed in the Monte Plata province, and it's a protected area. So this is my research team, botanists from the Dominican Republic, and this is Don Pablo. He's a knowledgeable healer, a plant specialist, somebody who makes botellas. And he's a guide in developing a trail that the general public can access. So he's leading us on the trail, and he's talking about plants, what they're used for, and based on his recommendations, we pick plant species that we then develop science for, that people can learn about their cultural heritage. And we even find orchids, such as this one, Lydia patu, used medicinally as well. So to finish my lecture, I have a small video that I made while we were there that I would like to show you.
Como estamos toda clase de años, que ha sido arriesgado, gente, como lo dije, mayores, de tiempo infantil, le preparamos presas, toda clase de raíces, para lo que sea, y que yo le preparo una botella que era siempre invitado, porque siempre está en el clavo, como digamos. Esto es un mundo que nunca en la vida lo han tomado. Y por eso que hay estos montes con cada tipo de mucha vida, porque estos son pavos intocables en la vera del agua. Esa es la manaca morada, porque hay blanca y morada. Esta es la morada que se coge para hacer botellas para la inversión. Cada con una clase de raíz para hacer botellas de ella. Esa trabaja directamente con los riñones, la raíz de manaca morada. Son 100 y pico de raíces que se le echan a la botella. La planta más importante no es solamente una, hay varias. Por ejemplo, mira, está el pegapalo. Esa es una de las botellas que se hace que no tiene la bolita de pegapalo en una botella. Ahí está el buco de riñón, como digamos, que es una de las más importantes. Que la base hay que echarle. Hay que echarle la raíz de manana, la flor de cocoillo, hay que echarle la jayama, hay que echarle la raíz de aruñagato, uno le echa pedacito de malla, la cola de caballo, también se le echa para botella, de toda clase de raíces, y son todos frutas, cada cual, como les expliqué ahorita, va haciendo cada cual de ella su función. Los árboles, toda la gente no lo conoce quizás por el mismo nombre natural que tiene. Y a veces un solo árbol en el tronco que tiene hasta hoy 3 nombres.
Que ahora mismo lo que tenemos son nombres comunes de cada una de las especies que estamos colectando. Entonces es importante colectar, estamos poniendo labels a cada una de las plantas que colectamos para luego ir al herbario ya con un taxónomo que tenga experiencia y que nos diga a qué familia pertenece y cuál es el nombre científico de ella. Si es una nueva especie para la ciencia, cuál es la importancia que tiene, si se han hecho investigaciones al respecto de esa planta. Así sabemos si las especies se encuentran en peligro de extinción, así también sabemos qué áreas podemos conservar. Por ejemplo, si está el terreno por el cual estamos caminando tiene muchas especies que se encuentran en peligro, así sabemos que esta zona puede ser un área protegida.
Este es un palo que le llaman yaya. Este palo no se aparece en todas partes. Se coge para hacer cabo de hacha, en arte, para muchísimas cosas. Ese palo no abunda. Si uno va en medio terminándose, llegamos a la montaña, la cosa, ese palo se va a ir cambiando. En la montaña siempre está específicamente en la orilla de la falda, de la costera de la loma. Se escucha ese palo, y así principalmente en los días. Usted sabe que nosotros mismos, la gente, somos descendientes de familia. Y hay familias que se van acabando y acabando, y así pasa con cierta manera, como son tan útiles para la obra de cualquier clase que sea, la gente siempre acude a Dios constante, un palo que se da muy derecho, en la parte donde se da, y lo cogen para muchísimas obras. Por eso se hace ocasional.
So what we saw during this process that we were filming is that he really became our teacher. Instead of us ethnobotanists going in there and taking the leading role, he became the leader of the team. So with that, I want to say thank you to all my collaborators and thank you to yourself for listening.
So, in the Dominican Republic, it looks like you can go out and like find these plants in the forest, or maybe they grow like a small scale in the garden or something. Is there such a thing as like a large scale like farm for these sort of plants to harvest and sell?
No, not really. This is really small scale people taking care of themselves with what they find in their home gardens, in their front yards, in their backyards, and on their lands. But what is so interesting is that it's such a cultural, commonly shared thing, and it remains that in New York City. Dominicans love to talk about their plants. I did my interviews, and you saw my list of health conditions, right? And I had several pages that I was just taking notes, and sometimes some people would interviews could take 2 hours, but some people would go on and on and on and say, oh wait, you're not going to have enough paper, and I'm still having things, or it's amazing. And the example that I gave with the immigration officer, he stopped the whole line, he started talking to me about the cunia mor, the bitter melon, and you know, we were afraid of it as a child because it's a vine, and because it's a vine, we thought there would be a snake hiding in there, and just
Are other cultures taking interest in these remedies?
Sorry?
Are other cultures taking interest in these remedies?
Are other cultures taking interest in?
In these remedies? The herbal remedies?
I think that a lot of cultures have their own remedies, but what you see in New York City, because all these communities live together, like Dominicans and Puerto Ricans and Mexicans, there won't always be that easy of a communication, but within the Caribbean, I often hear when I take the bus, people talking about herbal remedies for cholesterol or high blood pressure. And even in Latino grocery stores where they sell fresh vegetables or fruits, I've heard people commenting on, you should try celery for this because, and exchange of recipes within communities.
Do you think it will spread to other states?
Sorry?
Do you think it will spread to other states?
I think, yeah, I think it not necessarily spreading, but I think in all the states where there are Latino communities, Latino and Caribbean communities, this is already happening. I've given a webinar for a group called LAIDA, Latino and Hispanics in Dietetics and Nutrition, and they could ask me questions after my presentation. So these are practitioners themselves who were sharing stories about what was happening in their states, and it was all across the U.S.
Did you know how to speak Spanish before, or did you learn it in order to communicate better?
You have to. Without communication, nothing works. But so before I came to New York, to work at the New York Botanical Garden with the Dominican community, I had worked and lived in Bolivia for several years. And before because I'm originally from Belgium, from Europe, I learned Spanish there at the Spanish Language Institute, but then I went to the country and lived and worked there to really learn to speak Spanish better. And that took me to the DR. You really need to speak Spanish to communicate with people. And each community has their own way of pronunciation. Yeah.
So maybe 2 more questions. Where do people from New York get their plants or
Sorry?
Where do people from New York get their plants?
Yeah, the Botanica people, yeah. They get them from California, from Florida, from Dominican Republic, from Puerto Rico, from Mexico. Some botanicas even get plants from Israel, and some botanicas don't want to talk where they get their plants from.
Are you continuously doing research with your research team, or was this kind of like the finish of your research?
No, I'm continuing, and there is so much to research, and I'm also expanding towards other communities, Jamaicans in New York City. I want to include the Haitians too, one community at a time.
Great, that was our goal for study hall. So if you guys want to stay and ask any questions, feel free. Thank you so much.